This is just one big press conference trying to smear Donald Trump, trying to hurt Donald Trump.
If a president has to look over his shoulder or her shoulder every time he or she has to make a controversial decision, and worry after I leave office, if I go into jail for this, when my political opponents take power, that inevitably dampens the ability of the president.
It's not just President Trump has complained about the judge, so have I. I mean, there's publicly filed motions about what we believed gave grounds to the judge's recusal. So it's not just President Trump who's complained. It's his entire defense team.
We're all complainers. Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. So we showed you that because each of those lawyers represented Donald Trump, the citizen, in various cases. The first, Pam Bondi, was one of Trump's lawyers during his first impeachment trial. That seems like 1,000 years ago, but she was there. There she is on your screen. The second, the voice you heard, that was John Sauer arguing before the Supreme Court in Donald Trump's immunity case, the infamous SEAL Team 6 example. And the third man was Todd Blanche. He defended Donald Trump in his criminal hush money election interference case in New York and lost. The reason we run through that list is that each of these former personal defense lawyers for Donald Trump now work for us. They hold high-level positions in the U.S. government, in Trump's administration. Bondi is the U.S. Attorney General. John Sauer is the Solicitor General of the United States. And Todd Blanche is the U.S. Deputy AG. What Trump has ushered in is a new era, a new system of so-called justice, one dominated and operated by his own defense lawyers, people who have already shown loyalty to him. Gone are the days of nominating anyone in DOJ or jurists based on their independence or fealty to the rule of law. The latest of Trump's selections is a man we've been covering around here a whole lot, who by tomorrow could be on his way to a lifetime appointment as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, Emil Bove. Bove was Trump's lawyer alongside Blanche during that hush money trial. He has also since fired about 24 federal prosecutors who brought cases against January 6 rioters. He ordered the dismissal of the criminal case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams, which led to mass resignations of attorneys who disagreed with that decision. This afternoon, 900 former Justice Department attorneys wrote a letter to the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, warning them of the danger Bove would pose to the department if he is confirmed. According to additional memos obtained by CBS, quote, a group of former Justice Department officials are making an 11th hour effort to derail President Trump's nomination of Emil Bove. The effort includes outreach to sway the vote of Senator Thom Tillis, a North Carolina Republican whose objection doomed the nomination of another Trump surrogate earlier this year. The Senate Judiciary Committee is set to vote on Bove's nomination tomorrow. And if he gets past that, the full Senate will likely vote next week. A member of that committee, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, sent a letter to Bove requesting information about whether he is involved in withholding information related to the Jeffrey Epstein case. Quote, your involvement in the DOJ's review of the Epstein files is a matter of significant public importance, given the contradictory statements by Attorney General Bondi concerning the existence of an Epstein client list and DOJ's stated commitment to transparency. Furthermore, it warrants scrutiny whether the DOJ intentionally withheld evidence related to the trafficking and sexual abuse of minors to protect certain individuals. That is where we start the hour with Democratic Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. Senator, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that thorough reporting as well.
Well, you're involved in everything, so let's start where we ended. It feels like after 9 long years, you might have a taker in trying to do something bipartisan when it comes to the Trump administration. Do you have any behind-the-scenes communications with any Republicans on your questions about the Jeffrey Epstein case?
Yeah, we're in active conversation, so I don't want to give too many details, but this can only be two things. Either Bove and the Justice Department are lying about the Epstein situation, that they didn't have all these client lists and all this damning information about sex trafficking, or they're showing a dangerous lack of transparency, that they do have this information, but they're not sharing it publicly. They're either lying or this is lack of transparency. And Bovee served in a senior position. He was, as they say, in the room when it happened, when these discussions and these decisions are being made. He has information that is relevant to either the lying or relevant to the lack of transparency, and he is culpable. He is responsible for either one of those things, and he should come forward.
Well, lack of transparency, would you call it a cover-up?
Well, again, if what they said is true and they're not lying, that Pam Bondi had this damning evidence on her desk that she was just going to go through, that they went around, multiple members of the Trump administration went around and talked about this damning evidence, whipping people up. If they're not lying about that, then yeah, this is a cover-up of very serious allegations and charges.
Have you seen an instance in 6 months when any of those individuals have acted in a way that is separate from what Donald Trump either wants or asks them to do?
I mean, you really hit it on the head. And this is why you see even the Federalist Society and the heritage groups really breaking with Donald Trump, because the litmus test for Donald Trump now, and we've seen this with Hegseth and others, it's not qualifications for the job. Clearly, we've seen Republicans be talking about how unqualified these people are. The litmus test isn't a certain philosophy for him to put somebody on the bench. The litmus test is, are you loyal to dear leader or not? That is really what we're looking at here. And so you make the point of a lot of these figures that he is choosing because of their willingness to be enthralled with the president and the president's will. That's the problem we have in America right now, writ large, is the sense that there are people who are put in positions where they should be independent, like the Justice Department, where they should be offering checks and balances, like Republicans in the Senate and in the House. And they are not doing that. They are actually undermining the Constitution and surrendering power to the president that makes him less of a president and more of an authoritarian leader.
Do you see an opportunity to speak to his voters in a new and unique way? To say, you have been betrayed, and forget about all the policy opportunities and policy betrayals, where Trump wins because he says he's going to lower the price of grocery in front of melting meats at Bedminster during the campaign. That didn't seem to rattle his voters the way this has. Do you see a political opportunity to talk to his voters and bring them back to the Democratic coalition on matters of transparency?
Yeah, look, the litany now is long of his betrayals of people that put their trust in him. They're seeing their prices of their crib or car seats going up because of the tariff policy. They're losing their health care by the millions or having their rural hospital closed. Their farmers are being hurt in rural areas by his policies. You're seeing even people on his immigration policy. I've seen more and more people coming forward saying, I regret my vote because I didn't think he would take my spouse, who is nonviolent, who's in this country trying to get her visa, and now through your going into courthouses, you've deported them. The litany is long for reasons of people to feel betrayed, but this one, which has had such a life in the world of MAGA, so many people demanding that Donald Trump come in and offer transparency with these serious allegations of sex trafficking. And Donald Trump whipping this up into a fervor and trying to point fingers at Biden. Now, all of a sudden, when it's his Justice Department, when he has all the files and all the information, he suddenly is saying, nothing to see here, move along, move along. Well, that is a betrayal. It's either that he was lying to people or that he is now embodying the lack of transparency for serious allegations and potentially very serious crimes. So Donald Trump, we know you're a liar, so that's a possibility. And we also know that you have been leading in not releasing things, not releasing your tax returns, not releasing your health records. You have been hiding things from people for your entire time that you have been in American politics. One of these is true now. You are either doubling down on lies, which shouldn't be surprising to people, or doubling down on lack of transparency, which shouldn't be surprising people. But I hope that this is an eye-opening moment for a lot of people that put their trust, revealing what kind of liar and lack of transparency person that he is.
It also just feels like the earth shifting under him in a way that hasn't happened, frankly, in 9 years. He's been a political Houdini. He's been able to convince his voters of the power of the conspiracy around the 2020 election defeat he suffered, to the point where they stormed the Capitol and Republicans went along with it. This feels like, and I wonder if you disagree, the first example where the movement is moving in a different direction than its leader.
Yeah, well, I just want to, I'm not one of these people that is making Donald Trump out to a juggernaut that he is not. He has had 2 elections president that he won, but he had the majority of people voting against him both times. This time he won with 49.7% of the vote to Kamala Harris's 49.3% of the vote. This is not a landslide. It's not a massive mandate. But yes, there were a whole bunch of people in America that when after the storming of the Capitol, after the vicious beating and ultimately later deaths of police officers, he had a approval rating well into the tank, no chance of running, and somehow, through his lies, through the kind of horrific conspiracy theory that they're coming after me despite his convictions for criminal counts, he was able to win the presidency again. But now we have seen that peak again of 49.7% of the people. But now everything, even his immigration numbers, are underwater. And this president has revealed himself to America again. If the election was held today, he would lose. And he's now losing more support than he's already lost because of his health care policies, because of his policies on the economy, because of the horrific way he's going about taking nonviolent, non-criminal people and arresting them and throwing them into gulags in violation of Supreme Court orders. All of that. But this Epstein case that is revealing him again as a liar, as not doing what he said he was going to do, it's definitely affecting his support. And in this case, his base support of some of his most ardent people that have been behind him.